back on the 0 Hour. As always, it is a pleasure to speak with my regular guest, Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He's the author of a number of books. He is, I believe, visiting professor at New York University. I should know this by now, as well as professor emeritus at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And as I say, I always look forward to our conversations, and I have a topic in mind. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
So here's what I was thinking before we began. I'm looking at, looking at the headlines in the paper. More and more, I'm hearing about an immigration crisis in the United States and other countries as well. They're saying there's an immigration. I do a search on it right now. Top stories: Financial Times, New York immigration crisis exposes tensions among Democrats. CNN, inside New York's migrant crisis. National Review, San Diego, migrant crisis. We go on and on and on. Michael Bloomberg is opining on immigration status. Another piece: immigration is a crisis Democrats can't continue to ignore. Ross Douthat, or however it's pronounced in the New York Times, the permanent migration crisis. ABC News, the migrant crisis explained. What's behind the border surge? And here's what I keep thinking. I keep hearing that we have a labor problem in this country. There is concern in certain circles about wages being too high, a preposterous concern in my view, but still there it is. We have concerns about, we have billions upon billions of dollars being invested in automating jobs while there are living human beings coming to this country, among other things, and probably primarily in search of jobs. We have, of course, xenophobic fears of migration. 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants, possibly one of my parents too, I don't even know. Certainly immigrants from a couple cultures were part of my upbringing. I live in a neighborhood now that has immigrants from different parts of the world in it. My hometown of Utica, New York, which experienced a severe depression, and about half the housing stock was either abandoned or in disrepair, became a refugee resettlement center, and is apparently having a very good experience with that. So I'm wondering, what is and I'll just add one thing, which is I'm constantly being hectored, because I write a lot about social insurance, constantly being hectored by self-appointed budgetary experts who tell me that Social Security is in financial trouble, while a lot more people working and contributing to Social Security would take care of that. So I'm trying to figure out, first of all, why we think the way we do about immigration, and secondly, what exactly this crisis is.
Well, to be transparent, I should also add that both of my parents were immigrants. My father was French and my mother was German. I grew up speaking those languages, but I was born in Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio. So I've been an American all my life. For me, the immigration question has always been, and understandably so, a political football here in the United States, because we are a nation that did 2 things. Number one, ethnically cleanse the population that was here before the immigrants got here. Back, as we all know, in 1492 and all the rest of it. We have always been a nation that has a residue of understandable guilt. What was done to the indigenous people is unspeakably horrible, and everyone who isn't lost in ideology knows it and somewhere grapples with it as part of being a human being with some empathy and some feeling for that. Everybody also has in them the traces of the immigration of their own family. I mean, I know it because of both my parents were immigrants, but I really have to say, because it needs to be rearticulated, being an immigrant means you have gone through an extremely wrenching experience in 99% of the cases. Yes, there are a few rich or well-educated, blah, blah, individuals who don't go through such a hard time. But the vast, vast, vast majority are wrenched out of the communities into which they were born, wrenched out of the friends they made along the way, wrenched out of their language, wrenched out of their religious institutions if they participated in those, wrenched out of intimate relationships as well as, casual but important friendships and neighborhoods. I mean, it is awful. And as if that weren't bad enough, you're going to a country you can't possibly understand, often without being able to speak the language, unfamiliar with all of the little rules and routines of life that growing up in a society teaches you along the way without you even knowing that you're learning it. All of that is a monstrous, scary unknown into which you arrive, having been wrenched out of everything you do know. I mean, this is an enormous psychological trauma to impose on a person. Remember that those immigrants had their own family issues and growing up issues and schooling issues, but you're adding something with immigration that the rest of the population doesn't have. And one of the genuine things America can be proud of is that it did allow and welcome, millions of people coming here. It didn't treat them real well. If you were the latest arrival, you got treated very shabbily by the people who did the same thing you're going through now, 20 or 30 years earlier, et cetera, et cetera. It really is ugly. And in New York City, where I live, you can literally go to neighborhoods like Harlem or Bedford-Stuyvesant or the South Bronx and see in the buildings the records of the waves of immigration that came through, and what these people did and where they were mostly put, which is at the bottom of the economic ladder, and then had to crawl their way up. It's very tragic. I recently had an experience at the dentist I go to, and the dentist has assistants, and the assistants are a population, hyphenated Americans. I won't mention them because what I'm saying is true for them all. And if I pick one, it'll sound to someone like I'm selecting that I don't mean to. But they were ranting against immigrants, just the worst hostility you could imagine. Nice person dealing with me as a dental patient perfectly appropriately and all that, but just ranting against immigrants. And with my mouth pried open, I tried to say, gee, you in your way and I in mine have immigration written all over us from our parents or grandparents. And then this person looked at me and said, oh, no, that's not true. And I looked befuddled because I knew it was true. And they explained, no, our ancestors came over here ready, willing, and able to work.
Right.
These immigrants, the latest ones, are here to mooch off the system, to collect their welfare check, to get their food stamps or whatever it is. And so that they've worked out. The category immigrant dissolves into two subcategories. Working immigrants, i.e. good ones, like me, and then the bad ones, like them, not me, whoever the latest ones off the boat or the plane might happen to be. And when I said something like that back, you could see the person was taken aback, didn't agree with me, but I believe this was the first time someone had disagreed with this convenient rendition in which my grandparents were hard workers. You, recent immigrants, are the opposite.
And of course, this division of of the immigrant class and of the working class in general serves the agenda of the powerful who and the wealthy who sit astride all of this. I had a couple thoughts as you were talking, Richard Wolff, and one of them, in terms of this othering of the most recent batch of immigrants, I saw this parenthetically mentioned in an obituary for Philip Roth when he died. And Philip Roth, the writer, his death got, of course, enormous press attention. He was extremely well known, Jewish American writer. And it mentioned just briefly, one sentence, that he had he had appeared on a panel at Columbia University in the 1950s for minority writers. And the three minority writers who's representing minorities in literature were Ralph Ellison, the author of the brilliant book Invisible Man, a black man, Roth, a Jewish American, and John I'm going to blow it, Fonte, who actually a great novelist who wrote a book about my hometown of Utica, New York. And what struck me about that was that in the 65 or so years between that panel and Roth's death, two of those three groups were no longer really treated as minorities as such. They had obviously the benefit of whiteness. They could, assimilate more easily. But I thought there was something other than that too. This business about the latest group is more objectionable than the group that came before, the different waves of immigrants. I also remember the New York Post published some very racist caricatures of Muslims about maybe 15, 20 years ago. And in the aftermath, I got curious because I remembered some anti-Semitic cartoons in New York newspapers, and they looked almost the same in terms of characters, the beards, the noses, the hair, and of course they would never dream of publishing an anti-Semitic cartoon in 2005 or whenever it was. But it seems to me that the latest groups are always dropped to the bottom of the ladder and seen as a threat to the more established groups who sometimes perceive them that way, like your dental assistant, when that's not who they should be worried about at all. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's been, it's a demagogue's dream. Here you are, if you're a Texas politician, a Florida politician, a California politician, you have the typical story. There's a minority, and you are going to appeal for the majority to vote for you by declaiming against the minority. They are a minority, which means they are less of a threat to you politically. By whacking them, meanwhile, you can at least speak to the suffering of the majority, your own ethnic group, perhaps among them, and make votes, make elections, win elections by doing that. The hypocrisy of it, that you forget that you are an immigrant. I mean, look at Trump. I mean, his family are German immigrants, changed their name, as immigrants often do, so it would be more Anglo in this society. Gets up, starts his race for president by declaiming in the most stereotypic, horrible way against Mexican Americans. At the same time that at his golf club, he employs Mexican American immigrants for the age-old reason, guess what? They work hard and you can pay them next to nothing. And you can even cheat them because they're afraid to go to the authorities to complain if they haven't been paid the appropriate wage or the rest of this stuff, because they are like prisoners. They are, if they're not documented, they dare not go near any official office. But even if they are documented, but there might be someone in their family who isn't, then they can't again bring any attention down on their extended family, their household. It's just a horrible way of functioning. And because we allow our politicians to do this, we have a long history of demonizing immigrants. And so you can count on each generation to have in it people who will remember how that worked when they were younger and can teach it to the next generation. So we will always apparently have the people who make a career out of demonizing immigrants. By the way, the answer to that are two, and they're important. Number one, there is a simple reality. Total number of undocumented immigrants in the United States at any point over the last 20 years wouldn't have exceeded at most 10 million people. Probably isn't that big, but it could be. Maybe even 12. But we're a country of 325 million people. It is literally absurd to suggest that the economic malaise or the economic problems or the economic difficulties of a nation of 325 million people is at fault or is the fault of the 10 million poorest, least educated, most desperate people imaginable, who are the ones that are in the main coming here. If that's so crazy, you know there has to be something else going on. And finally, the point you alluded to earlier, which is we have a so-called labor shortage. Economics literature is full of it. Then there's all the literature about the social security system, because our demographics are, we have lots more older people and lots fewer younger people. The overwhelming majority of immigrants are younger and are going to go into jobs, which is what they hope to get here. They're motivated for that. They're driven to that. They're willing to accept the worst work if it's steady, the worst pay if it's regular, and all the rest. And then what people don't understand, which I as an economist have had to always understand, is if you get a person who's somewhere between 15 years of age and 35 years of age, and that's where most immigrants fall, then you have an incredible advantage being the country to which the immigrant goes, because an enormous amount of wealth has been expended on you in the country you are leaving. They're the ones, who paid for the hospital where you were born. Your society is what educated you in public schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the costs that a society bears to bring someone up to working age, that all those costs have been, incurred in a place you've left. You bring the fruits of all of that. All that has been invested in you by your country of origin is lost to that country. They incurred the expense, particularly, for example, of educating you, but it's the United States that gets the benefit of your educated labor. That's a transfer of real wealth from the poor to the rich. It's Robin Hood in reverse. And every immigrant carries that in him or in her, whether they are, a PhD from some country in the world, or they're a poor farmer. Either way, they bring skills, education, accumulated knowledge, capability that another country paid for. And there's no reverse version of that. There's no flood of Americans with the education they got here, bringing it to contribute to Guatemala or to Nigeria or wherever else it might have happened. So it's a one-way transfer for which we ought to be grateful as a society, because we get the benefit without having to pay the cost. it also should help you understand the developmental difficulties of many third world countries, because they spend money to educate people who then go and work not in the poor country that paid for their education, but in one of the richest countries on earth, which arguably needs it least. There's a perverse quality to all of this that really undermines the glib dismissal. What did Trump say? Oh, Mexico doesn't send us their best, and then went on to list, criminals and all drug dealers and all the rest of it. I mean, it is so grotesquely imbalanced and unfair that it makes you realize that there must be something else going on, because on the merits of the case alone, anti-immigrant is an ugly, inhumane, inaccurate demonization of people you ought to have some compassion for.
And there's, you mentioned Trump. There's I don't know if it's ironic or not, but there's a kind of tragic circularity to all this. German Americans and Trump's father was a very, I would say, equally disreputable individual, but during the time that he came to this country, I believe, which was probably, or Trump's grandfather, which was probably the first couple decades of the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson, as president, was treating German immigrants the way that George W. Bush and, to an extent, Barack Obama, as president, treated immigrants from Muslim countries after 9/11, that you had, looked into it, wrote about it at the time. You had, they were closing down German language newspapers. They were, German-owned businesses were being boycotted or harassed. German churches, they were putting informants in German houses. Well, I mean, the parallels are quite striking, and yet no sort of multi-generational memory seemed to imbue. Also, Kevin McCarthy, the House Majority Leader, based in Bakersfield, California, home of the Okies, right, as they were called, originally a derogatory term for immigrants from Oklahoma to California, who, whether, if you read your history or just your John Steinbeck, they were despised. They had posses at the border trying to keep them out. They were placed in refugee camps. And yet, many of those same groups, and I'm not targeting individuals here or stigmatizing individuals, I'm just saying that in so many immigrant groups, from your dental technicians to, Trump to, so many descendants of immigrants don't seem to learn the lesson of immigration, or what should be the lesson of immigration. You'd think they would come out of it with a welcoming attitude towards people who want to come to this country, but it doesn't happen. I honestly, other than the sort of cynical demagoguery, maybe that's the only explanation, but I can't think of another.
Well, there is another strain to this story, which is that we are a country that was born in a contradiction which we've never really confronted. We had people who came because of a pretty intense commitment to Christianity, and practicing it in a particular way. I'm thinking of the people we normally call Puritans and all of that. And so they believed in a deity, and that the deity was all good, but that there was evil in the world, and the deity was fighting against the evil, God and the devil, and all of that. Meanwhile, they were busy slaughtering an entire population. This is a hard circle to square. This is a hard contradiction to live out. You've just slaughtered, native children, and you're busily praying to a God who loves all children. Yes, but it's a God who's fighting against the devil. Your enemies are the devil. The devil is your enemy. There's a strain in American politics. You can see it right now that we have a disagreement. We have a disagreement with Russia about the proper borders in Europe. Not a very new disagreement. The borders in Europe have moved around with stunning regularity for thousands of years. But here we are with another one, the boundary between Russia and Ukraine. And we are busy, as we have been now for 2 to 3 years, demonizing this Putin character. I don't admire him either. But what is this about? What is this need to demonize the other, not to not give the other any space to have fears and anxieties and ambitions and avarice, good qualities, bad qualities, woven? No, no, no. This is evil incarnate. And by contrast, we are whatever the opposite of evil incarnate. If this were just childish, that would be bad enough. But it isn't childish because you kill large numbers of people wrapped up in this idea, that the world can be organized. And then, of course, you can't sit down. Who negotiates with the devil? We don't do that. The devil has to be expunged. We have ceremonies in American religious traditions, many of them, of literally, whether you're dunked underwater or whether you are put through a penance procedure, you're required to confess in order to cleanse yourself. And that's a very big part. And the immigrant is an other. So instead of being a poor, desperate person trying to save his or her family, they become an invasion that doesn't speak our language, doesn't share our values. Whoop, we're on the way to the demonization program, and then you have a front page story in a small town newspaper where somebody who has killed another person is identified as an immigrant who killed another person, as if the immigrants have any greater predilection for that kind of behavior, which document after document shows that they don't, et cetera, et cetera. It is a deep, deep issue. And people should, at the very least, open themselves up to shying away from simple-minded explanations for something that isn't simple at all. Many businesses in America rely on immigrant labor. Our food industry, overwhelmingly, not a minor matter, food, and many other industries will live or die with those immigrants. The taxes they pay are crucial to the functioning of our society. The jobs they do, the inventions they make. Come on, I mean, this is really a kind of blindness. And I want to remind people also of one little economic effect. One of the major pushes for immigration is the desire of employers to have desperately poor and therefore low-paid workers in abundance for them to have to hire when they're growing, to replace workers who dare to go on strike or try to form a union. The uses for immigrants, especially those without documents, because the worker, the undocumented immigrant that you hire is effectively a slave. The risk to them of anything that might displease you, you can call the Immigration Service, appropriately named ICE these days by its acronym. Your dependence on your employer not to say things to ICE, true or untrue, your inability to complain about any abuse you're suffering, make you the ideal, and go get more of the undocumented that you may be related to or friends with or neighbors of, I would like to have you all because you are my ideal, a necessarily docile, cheap labor force. And you'd have to have extraordinary religious commitments not to take advantage of that. I live in New York City. There is no construction industry in this city. Now, who's going to build the housing, the hotels, the tourist attractions, and all the rest? It's all immigrants now. If you see a non-immigrant, that person is in a supervisory position, which is the only one you would get such a person to take. But they supervise an army of immigrants, documented and undocumented. But we all benefit in countless ways from this. So to talk about the ways we might suffer, and there are some ways, just as there are ways the immigrants are made to suffer after a terrible trip across a desert driven by a member of your own ethnic community who abuses you like crazy, etc. After you've gone through all of that, you arrive here at the land of freedom and equality, and then, you get abused. And in your abuse, you kick back, and then you abuse and that's the opportunity of a lifetime for the demagogic politician to insert himself right in there and make the whole thing worse in exchange for some votes. It's not a pretty picture, but the first step is not to get lost in simple-minded demonizations that really, in the end, solves nothing and helps no one. If really the United States didn't want to receive waves of immigrants, then the most humane and in the long run, probably the cheapest way to deal with it is not to reinforce a global economic system that divides the work into rich enclaves in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, and then a vast sea of more or less poor people, vast majority of the world, and then be surprised or miffed or angry that those rendered poor would rather raise their children in those parts that aren't poor. I mean, either deal with that situation or don't go into this area, because otherwise you just become the patsies for the demagogues. And do you really want to look in the mirror as you get older and recognize that as your function?
So maybe at some point we'll talk about, what the global scenario would look like, because it does seem that way, that as long as there's this horrific imbalance in wealth, that, you'll have this exploitation in the wealthy countries, especially ours, along with this demonization. But we won't have time to do this today, but I'll close with this from my end. My grandparents on the Jewish side were very anxious to, on the one hand, preserve their cultural identity, not so much religious belief as a cultural belief. But my grandfather was a good socialist, but at the same time, they wanted to be as American as possible. They spoke as little Yiddish as possible. And I asked my grandmother once, why did you call my father Seymour? Because Seymour is, in our, when we were kids, was a stereotypically Jewish name. And I said, why did you pick Seymour? She said, it was the most American name I could think of. So, there was this desire to be American, which I suppose if it doesn't mean nationalism, and it doesn't mean finding another group to exclude, and it didn't in their case, my grandparents' case, is a nice thing. You want to belong to the society you've joined, but maybe some way we can both internally and globally re-envision what migration means.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think it is tragic that the influence goes both ways, that a capitalist system, in my judgment, that is so unsuccessful in bringing equality to the experience, economic equality, I now mean, to the experience of this planet that has forever created unspeakable inequality among nations, within nations. What that does is it creates a guilt in those who do well, who are positioned in the right part of the world, who have a job, have an income, and who face the fact, at least, that the rest of the world is very poor, then are confronted with a problem. Why are we rich and why are they poor? And there are two answers to that. One, you rip them off, which is unbearable, whether you're a Christian or not. That is too difficult for you to bear. And that leads you then to the other, or at least to be open to the other explanation, which is we're smart, they're stupid. And they're poor because they're stupid. And in other words, our wealth is in some sense legitimate. Right. It is the fruit of something we have, we do, we are. And their poverty is their fault. The need to see that and to pretend that the other isn't a possibility not only flies in the face of what the facts of the matter are, but it also means you need to think in a way that effectively demonizes the vast majority of people on the planet. They weren't smart enough, or if you like, they didn't work hard enough to make it into the ranks we occupy. And that is a stepping stone to what is fascism. It's very, very dangerous to begin to get on that very slippery slope.
So maybe our job, the job of people like us, is to let people know that you can be part of an evil system, but that doesn't mean you're evil yourself, and that your moral obligation is not to hate yourself, but to understand the system and work to change it.
Yep.
So
that's all you can do. You can't we're all dependent on the system, and we have no business accusing each other of doing what we have no option but to do. But the answer is, all right, now you have life, now you have a job, now you have some income, now you have some social position. Use it to make the world a better place. That's the absolution for the living in a system you didn't choose to live in, and that you're not responsible for making work the way it does.
Well said. And on that, we'll have to close for now. Again, my guest, Professor Richard Wolff. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I always get new insights from it. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure, and the same to you. It's been an enjoyable years of working out a number of these ideas. I've benefited a lot from it, and my hope is that we'll come up with a way to share it as well.
I look forward to working on that. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to Zero Hour.